So let's just go ahead and get started. A guide to conflict resolution. Understanding conflict, right? Conflict is a normal part of any healthy relationship, and conflict is to be resolved in a healthy manner, not ignored, right? I'm sure we can all imagine or recall what it looks like when we choose to ignore conflict rather than address it. Understanding conflict, we want to recognize that conflict is more than just a disagreement, right? Conflicts continue to fester when they are ignored. We also want to respond to conflicts based on or we do respond rather to conflicts based on our perceptions. So we want to be aware of what those perceptions are and how they influence our views. Conflicts trigger strong emotions, right? Some of us might say that disagreements can trigger some strong emotions, but when it reaches the stage of conflict, it definitely can trigger some strong emotions. Um, but how often do we view conflicts as an opportunity for growth, right? Probably rarely if we are, of the mood where we try to avoid conflict. I know for me, I'm not the biggest when it comes to conflict. I prefer not to have conflict. But I do recognize and understand that conflict is necessary. So when I am faced with conflict, I'm definitely one to want to resolve it and not want to have it linger. But I would also go as far as to say that, I'm also learning that conflict, this aspect that conflict is an opportunity for growth. Growth as an individual, growth for the relationships that are experience that I may be experiencing that conflict with, and it's also an opportunity for growth for the other person. Some principles of successful conflict management. One is that conflict is inevitable and both positive and negative consequences can occur depending on how the conflict is managed, right? Generally speaking, in short, if we don't manage them effectively or if we manage them negatively, then they may result in negative consequences. Whereas if we manage them positively, the expectation should be that there will be positive consequences. Right. The results are likely to be better with active engagement rather than avoidance. Right. So we want to actively engage the conflict, not avoid it or put it off. Um, People must be motivated to address conflict. Um, as I mentioned previously, I'm not a big fan of conflict, so I have rarely been one to be motivated to address conflict. Um, and when I am motivated, that motivation comes out of not wanting the conflict to linger. Because again, I've learned and recognized that if you don't address the conflict, that's all that will happen is that it will linger, it will fester, and it potentially will get worse. Um, Behavioral, cognitive, and emotional skills can be acquired through effective conflict management, right? So behaviorally, I may over time, as I work through conflict with others or even some internal conflicts, I may begin to learn how to better manage my behaviors, my actions, and how at times they may result in some conflict, and many times result in conflict that doesn't have to be necessary. All right. Cognitively, allowing myself to develop more effective problem solving skills, right? To be more solution oriented rather than, just kind of focusing on the problem. And then emotionally, right? Being in tune with my emotions, and the more in tune I'm able to be with my emotions, hopefully also growing in my ability to be in tune with others' emotions, and being able to utilize that collectively to one reduce the amount of conflicts that I find myself in because I'm more emotionally aware. Emotional skills require self-awareness, right? In order for me to tap in and to properly manage my emotions, I've got to first be aware of them, right? So if I'm battling different emotions and I can't even identify or name what those emotions are, then I'm already kind of at a disadvantage when it comes to knowing how to handle and navigate it, because I'm not even sure about what I'm feeling or how I feel. The environment must be neutral. It must feel safe. Um, Oddly enough, I'm thinking about sports and how in sports you have two teams that play. And when you have two teams competing against each other, both teams can't be the home team, right? Only one team gets to be the home team. And generally speaking, when the team at home, is typically expected to have the advantage because they got their fans that are cheering for them and whatnot. And so when you think about conflict, kind of consider that. If somebody feels like they are the away team, if you will, or that you have the home field advantage uh, from a space standpoint, that might not feel like a really safe environment to navigate or manage the conflict at hand. And so it may be necessary to find a more neutral environment. So at this point, this is probably about the third time that we have said conflict is inevitable, right? But combat, that's optional. So conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. So think about that. How many times do we find ourselves in conflict with someone and we're quick to go in combat mode, right? Um, those two do not have to be one and the same. And so we want to be mindful of those moments when we are operating as if they are synonymous and one and the same, right? So I don't want to treat my conflict like it's combat, because it doesn't have to be. Some common causes for conflict is the lack of clarity, poor communication, lack of clear jurisdiction, personality differences, conflicts of interest, and just change, right? So lack of clarity, just simply misunderstanding somebody, right? Maybe having the wrong expectations or the wrong guidelines. Um, if you think about it, have you ever had expectations of someone that you didn't verbalize to them? So you internally have an expectation from somebody, but you haven't communicated that expectation to them. And then you get mad when they don't live up to that expectation. Uh, Obviously, that's not fair. But secondly, it's going to definitely result in conflict. Um, Whereas it could have been avoided if I would have just simply communicated my expectations, right? So that kind of goes hand in hand and touches on the poor communication piece too. So if we aren't properly or effectively communicating things, it gives room for misunderstanding, and misunderstandings, if not handled properly, can result in conflict. Lack of clear jurisdiction. That's something when you think about it from a foster care standpoint, you are in a position where you are co-parenting, right? And so if you think about something as simple as getting a haircut or getting a kid's hair done, right? Um, you might take it upon yourself, or maybe even the kid takes it upon themselves to get a certain hairdo or hairstyle, and they're taking full advantage of the fact that they know that their parent under normal circumstances might not be okay with that or wouldn't be okay with that hairstyle, and because they're in a new space, new household, they're like, oh yeah, let me get this done. um, that parent's probably going to be upset and may feel like you as the resource parent was out of bounds, right? And so not having like a lack of clear jurisdiction is can definitely result in potential conflict. Personality differences, right? We just, you know, something as simple as being an introvert or an extrovert, right? Generally speaking, extroverts are typically associated with being more outgoing, more personable, and engaging and things of that nature, whereas an introvert is more inclined to be one to keep to themselves, and enjoy, that alone time. And so something as simple as that type of personality difference can result in conflict, because if I'm an extrovert and I'm being all super outgoing and engaging, I could actually invade your space and, come off a little bit strong, and that can result in conflict because I'm not recognizing that difference that we have, and I may be viewing you or thinking that you're just like me, not understanding that, you have a greater need for space and, some of that alone time, and maybe have less tolerance for the engagement and the outgoing personality that I might have. And then conflicts of interest, right? So this is very common, a common source of conflict for uh, parents and children, right? And we kind of went through the child and development piece. As kids start to get older and start to spend more time with their peers, uh, that becomes more of their interest, right? And for us as parents, while there's a part of us that don't mind you having that interest, we also recognize that you're at a highly influential stage in your life or impressional period in your life. And so we're going to be a lot more sensitive to the friends that you have, the company that you keep. And so there's a conflict of interest because your interest is to spend as much time with your peers and friends as possible. And as a parent, my interest may be to limit and control that, in the sense where I'm trying to manage it, but I have to learn to let you manage it and to educate you on how to pick your friends so that you're not putting yourself in harm's way or in bad situations. And then change, right? Change is inevitable. Change is a part of life, but change is not always comfortable, right? And so that can certainly be a source of conflict for us as well, adjusting to change. So some common responses to conflict is we can either choose to avoid it, we can engage in accommodating, we can compete, right? Which can, kind of be similar to that whole combat piece, right? We can engage in compromise, or we could collaborate, right? We've already determined that avoidance is definitely not ideal, because it just gives the opportunity for the conflict to kind of snowball and become even larger when we choose to ignore it. Um, so we definitely want to, minimize the avoidance component of it, right? Um, while avoidance might be okay for some minor conflicts, in the sense that, maybe I need to do some soul searching or some self reflection to realize that, uh, what I perceived as an external conflict actually was more of an internal conflict. And so there may be grounds in some instances for some of those minor conflicts to, kind of, as they say, pick your battles, right? Um, because if I am choosing to address every little conflict that comes up, um, I might find myself faced with a challenge down the line when it's time to really address a major conflict. That person that I've been addressing all these little minor conflicts with, they may not even be open at the time that I need them to address a more important and pertinent conflict. Accommodation, right? So accommodating, only one party has their needs met, right? And so definitely want to be mindful of that, because let's say looking at it through the lens of the person who's doing the accommodating, if you are that person and you are accommodating to in essence, avoid the conflict or minimize the impact of the conflict, you're going to walk away. And while you may be satisfied for the moment, you may begin to start harboring resentment down the line, right? And so we want to be mindful and careful of that. Uh, Likewise, if you are the person who the accommodation is being made for, then you may be being limited in your ability to really grow through conflict, because for all intents and purposes, you may not even feel like there's a conflict being had because the other person has accommodated you. Right. And so you may be missing out on opportunities where you legitimately need to grow in certain areas. And so that's the challenge with accommodation, is that one party has their needs met, the other does not. And it's certainly not a win-win situation for all parties involved. Competing. Again, as I mentioned before, competing can be synonymous or can feel like combat, right? Because in a competition, typically there's one winner, there's one loser, right? And rarely does anybody want to be the one on the losing end. To my knowledge, many, if not all of us, want to be able to identify ourselves as being the one that won, right? And so when we engage in competition as it relates to how we handle the conflict, we want to be mindful that that may very well end up being the results, is that one person feels like they've lost in the conflict, the other person feels like they've won. Now, compromise. Compromise, not so bad, right? Even though we do want to be cautious. But compromise is focused on fixing the problem with a set amount of resources, with there being balance of assertiveness and cooperativeness, right? So the goal with compromise is that both sides may have to sacrifice something, right? And sometimes that sacrifice may not feel fair on both sides. There may be times where you are engaging in compromise to address a conflict, and one side might feel like they compromise more than the other. So that is a challenge that we do face with compromise, but compromise can be a good way to handle conflict. But the most ideal way for us to handle conflict would be this idea of collaboration, right? So it offers a broader view of problem solving with a balance of assertiveness and cooperativeness. And it usually involves all parties having their needs met, right? So this goes a step farther from compromise, because we're collectively coming together to figure out, really, kind of going back to that theme of what can we do, or what's required of us to have an outcome that feels like a win-win for all parties involved. So let's look at some healthy and unhealthy ways of managing and resolving conflict, and kind of see what they look like side by side, right? So one way or one unhealthy response to conflict is a failure to even recognize and respond to the things that matter to the other person, right? When we don't feel like someone cares about what we care about, it makes it pretty difficult to engage in conflict and to work through or work towards that whole collaboration piece. Whereas the healthy approach is to be empathizing with the other person's viewpoint, right? Because what we don't lack the ability to do is understand our viewpoint, right? So I'm clear on how I feel, but what may be a challenge for me is understanding how the other person feels. And so it's pretty important to take a moment and say, okay, I already know how I feel. Let me take a moment and investigate and understand, so that I can empathize with how this other person might be feeling as it relates to the conflict at hand. Explosive, angry, hurtful and resentful reactions, right? Obviously unhealthy, as opposed to calm, non-defensive, and respectful reactions, right? As they say, think before you speak, right? I wish I could remember the acronym. Maybe I'll share it at the end of the group if I can find it. Um, but one of the things when we think about it is I think the H stands for helpful, for example. So in the midst of a conflict, when I'm taking a moment to think, one of the things that I want to consider is what I want to say or what I'm preparing to say. Is it going to be helpful in resolving the conflict? Uh, Withdrawal of love. Ooh, ouch, that hurts, right? Um, so I'm in conflict with you, and so the things that I would typically do to communicate my love for you, I start to withhold those things. Yeah, that's no fun. So we definitely don't want to do that. Uh, Instead, we want to operate from a place where we are exhibiting a readiness to forgive and forget, right? Now, the funny thing about this whole phrase forgive and forget is the forget piece, right? That may not mean that we forget it in the sense that we never remember that it ever occurred, but what we are working towards is kind of more so um, forgetting it from the sense of maybe how hurtful it was for us, so that we're not harboring resentment and anger and hurt and frustration, right? So but that requires me to process and actually address how I feel up front so that I can get to that place, right? So if I don't work out and work through those emotions, it's going to be very difficult for me to forget in that aspect. And if I can't forget as it relates to that, then it's just as difficult for me to forgive. Failure to compromise or see other person's side, right? Definitely going to just potentially make the conflict worse or make it last longer. And then willingness, instead, we want to have a willingness to seek compromise, right? So as we mentioned before, compromise can be a good thing. And, we may very well want to work through compromise. We just want to be mindful that compromise means that, each party is making a sacrifice. And so we do want to be mindful of what those sacrifices are so that we're understanding of it, right? Because we don't want to take those sacrifices for granted. Feeling fearful of or avoiding conflict. So it's not unnatural to experience and feel fear, but we don't want that fear to overtake us to the point where we do engage in avoiding the conflict. And so that's the kind of the slight difference there of how we want to be mindful of how we're addressing or managing the fear that may be associated when facing conflict. The flip side of that, though, or the healthy response, is that we want to believe that facing conflict head on is the best for both sides, right? We need to know that. And sometimes that's easier said than done, right? Because let's face it, conflict does not feel good. And so there are times in which we might feel like facing the conflict head on. We might feel like maybe it's premature for the person, right? We may feel like that person can't handle it, or maybe we feel like we can't handle it and we're handling it prematurely. But we have to overcome that and know that at the end of the day, the truth is, if we face that conflict head on, it is eventually going to have the best outcome for us, especially if we manage it effectively. So some things that impact our ability to successfully manage and handle conflict are things like our ability to manage stress quickly. Um, and while we're managing that stress, the ability to also remain alert and calm, right? And this is something that may take practice. It may take time to develop that skill, to develop that resiliency, so that we are able to effectively navigate those stressful points in the conflict. Because in a conflict, there may be times where it's nice, calm, and collect, but there's inevitably also going to be those times where we hit subject matters that may be sensitive to us or sensitive to the other person, and with that may trigger or hit a nerve, and so we want to be able to be alert of that and remain calm in those moments, which again ties to the whole control of emotions and behavior, right? So I want to be aware of the nerves that I may be hitting, the triggers that I may be touching, for myself as well as for others, so that I can manage and properly navigate my own emotions and my own behavior, but also, support the other person that is involved in this conflict, as they are facing their own emotions and having to navigate and manage their own behaviors. We want to pay attention to the feelings being expressed as well as the spoken words of others, right? This kind of goes to the conversation that we had with effective communication, right? I'm listening to what's being said, but I also want to be in tune with the feelings and the emotions around what's been said. Kind of makes me think about growing up. I remember my parents on several occasions reminding me it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Be aware of and respectful of differences, right? We are all unique. We are all different in our own ways. We carry different perspectives. We have different opinions, and we just naturally look at things differently, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that others are not going to always see things exactly the way that we see it, and we have to work to get to places of understanding in those times, and that starts with us being aware and respectful of those differences. Two core skills for successful conflict resolution is, again, that quick stress relief and emotional awareness, right? So our ability to experience the stress, but quickly release it and not remain there. Because if I remain there, then I may very well have an emotional response and lack the control that's necessary for me to manage my emotions, and therefore my behavior. And then emotional awareness is just, again, going back to the whole conversation about knowing what it is that I'm feeling. One of the things that I've tried to make a habit of personally is to engage in more and more self-reflection. So as I'm having interactions with other people, and I find myself experiencing moments of discomfort, I want to take those moments and pause and begin to explore what exactly am I feeling, right? So one, let me put a name or a word to what I'm feeling. Let me make sure that I'm clear on what that word, that is the correct word that describes exactly how I'm feeling. And then from there, begin to kind of think about, all right, now why am I feeling this way? All right. And so what that's helped me to do over time is to, one, better manage my interactions and exchanges with, those individuals moving forward. But two, at times when it's appropriate, being able to also express to that person how they're making me feel, and even more why I may be feeling that way. In some instances, I may discover that the reason I feel that way is because of a past experience that I've had, right? And so I'm able to communicate to the person, hey, here's how you made me feel. Here's why it made me feel that way. And so, one, they might grow and understand that, oh man, I didn't know that about you. I didn't know that you had that experience, right? And so maybe they start to be a little bit more understanding and a little bit more mindful now when when we're sharing a certain environment or engaged in a certain activity that is normally associated with them doing or saying something that had been offensive or hurtful to me, and vice versa. Being able to manage and relieve stress in the moment is the key to staying balanced, focused, and in control no matter what challenges you face. Let's just think about that for a moment. All right, so the more equipped I am at being able to release or relieve stress quickly, in short, the more grounded I'm able to be. All right. It's interesting as I think about this. The image that kind of came to my mind is I don't even know what they call it, but I remember in gym in gym class, we would put our head down on a baseball bat and kind of run around in circle a couple of times, like at least 3 times, sometimes more than that, and then you would have to, after doing that, kind of race to a certain point, to a line, right? And you do it to be competitive, to see who can be the fastest. But one of the things that challenged you is being able to, it makes you dizzy, right? So you had to try to recover, and after being disoriented, orient yourself as quickly as possible, because the quicker you could orient yourself, the quicker you could get to that endpoint that you were racing to. And so when you think about it and like kind of look at that imagery, the quicker I can relieve stress, which is likely to disorient me, the quicker I can get to that endpoint of successfully resolving the conflict. So stress interferes with the ability to resolve conflict by limiting our ability to, one, hear what someone else is really saying. Again, to accurately read another person's nonverbal communication, right? So seeing when their words are in alignment with what their body is saying and vice versa, as well as those times when there's a conflict between what they're saying and what their body is saying. It allows us to be aware of our own feelings, right? It allows us to be in touch with our deep-rooted needs. And then lastly, it allows us to communicate our needs clearly, all right? So definitely want to be aware of the stress that I'm feeling in particular moments so that I'm not allowing that stress to disrupt my ability to do any of these things, so that I can be effective in my conflict resolution. Emotional awareness, right? So we've talked about relieving stress. Emotional awareness is the other key component, right? And emotional awareness is the key to understanding ourselves as well as others. And if we don't know how we feel, then, or why we feel that way, then we don't or won't be able to communicate effectively to others to resolve disagreements, right? I've already stated that. So this is really just kind of restating what I've already mentioned, is that I have to be aware of what I feel and why I feel that way if I want to, make any headway in trying to help someone else understand that, right? I can't expect you to understand how I feel and why I feel that way if I don't know that myself. Now, you could perhaps, if you are more emotionally aware and have what we would call a higher emotional IQ than I do, you might be able to assist me in navigating that. So whoever has the the greater emotional intelligence in that conflict can be really instrumental in helping the other person to navigate that space, right? But at bare minimum, I do want to be aware of my own emotional strengths, weaknesses, and be in tune with my emotions, period. Some things that emotional awareness helps us with is it helps us to understand ourselves, including what is really troubling us. It helps us to understand what is really troubling other people. It can help us to stay motivated until the conflict is resolved. It can help us to communicate clearly and effectively our thoughts, our feelings, as well as just simply communicating clearly and effectively with others. And lastly, emotional awareness helps us to, hopefully have more interest in others, as well as garner greater influence with others. Makes me think about the saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? And so you could be the smartest person on a particular topic, and none of that will matter to me unless I know that you first care about me, right? Because why else would I care about what you know? You know, yeah, you know a lot about it. I might be interested in the fact that you know a lot about it and you're very knowledgeable, but what does that mean to me, right? How does that information impact me? How does it influence me? It could be very essential. It could be very important information that's needed for me. But if I don't think that you first care about me, I may be less inclined to listen and hear what it is that you have to say. All right. And so if we kind of think about that and look at that through the lens of our children, when they know that we love and care about them, they tend to be more inclined to listen to and hear what it is that we have to say, right? Even when they think that they might know better, even when they think that they might swear that they know more than us, even though we've lived longer, had more experiences, it's oftentimes not until they realize and recognize that we genuinely love and care about them that they are more inclined to listen to what it is that we have to say. Whereas if the opposite is true and they are questioning whether or not we love and care about them, they may question our motives, right? And so when we question someone's motives, it can interfere with us accepting their knowledge of a particular subject matter. So this is a funny quote. Speak when you are angry and you will make the best speech you will ever regret. We've all probably had a moment or two where we've been there, where we have allowed anger to get the best of us or the better of us. And, in response to our anger, said a few things that we, wish we could take back. Right. But once it's said, it's out there, and we just kind of have to take it and deal with whatever consequences come from that. So it's important for us to manage our anger and not allow it to get the better of us. Because anger if we're not careful, anger can cause us to speak prematurely, and say some things that we may very well mean, but say them in a manner that is not productive or constructive. So let's take a moment and assess where we are or where our level of emotional awareness is. So on any particular day, on any given day, um, how often, for example, am I able to quickly recognize when I'm getting impatient, or when I'm getting angry, or when I'm getting frustrated? Uh, how often am I making note of when I'm happy, when I'm feeling peaceful, when I'm feeling comforted? All right. Am I able to, like, from day to day, if I was to go and kind of look through my week, just the week that, like, it's we're in Thursday now, right? So if I just look back on my week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and consider each day, how capable am I at being able to jot down and make note of those different emotions and how frequently I had them from one day to the next? Or have I gotten so comfortable to the point where I'm just kind of on autopilot, and I just kind of go and navigate the day as it comes, and not really paying attention to exactly how I feel throughout the course of a day? All right. As we continue to pay attention to our emotional awareness, we want to also pay attention to body language, right? Now, the challenge with this is it's easy for us to notice, perhaps, and pay attention to other people's body language, because just the perspective that we have. We are living in this world, and it's just naturally easy for us to look at and to see others, right? Generally, in short, in order for me to see myself, I typically have to go look at myself in a mirror, right? And you know, we don't live in a world where mirrors are everywhere around us, right? We don't live in a room full of mirrors. So I have to, in other words, be able to, one, pay attention to how others may be responding to me because of my body language or as a result of my body language. And at the same time, although I'm not fully able to see, maybe all parts of me, I do need to look at my body language and what I can see and how I am, maybe standing, or, maybe how I am sitting or resting when I'm having an interaction and exchange with somebody. I may want to consider that and be mindful of the body language and what that body language could potentially communicate to the person that I am interacting with. Some tips for resolving conflict: one, listen for what is felt as well as what's said. Make conflict resolution a priority rather than winning, right? So, again, we're not in combat, it's not a competition. We should not be working towards being able to say, I was right. That's not the goal. We want to focus on being present, right? So being attentive and aware. We want to resist the urge to be thinking about, what we may need to do later on in the day or later on in the week, and just think about the conversation at hand or the conflict at hand. Pick our battles. Kind of goes back to that conversation around minor conflicts and major conflicts, right? Recognizing, what, some of these minor conflicts may not be that big. I may not, now, if it's repeating itself, then yeah, I may need to address that. But if it's like one of those one-offs, a one-time occurrence, with some of those minor conflicts, I may want to decide to say, you know what, I'm gonna let that one go for now. If it happens again, I'll address it then. But for now, I'll save that for something else. But then again, I may want to address it. It may be a one-time occurrence, but even if it's a one-time occurrence, is it similar to something else that has occurred that might have been different in content, but the context of it or the emotions around it may be similar. I may want to, navigate and address that conflict as well. But short and long story short is I do want to be mindful and pick my battles wisely. Be willing to forgive. Forgiveness is powerful. And let's face it, we all need forgiveness. We have all made our fair share of mistakes. We have all, at one time or another, disappointed someone, upset someone. And so the same way we would want them to forgive us for those transgressions, we ought to be willing to forgive others for theirs. And then lastly, knowing when to let something go. Again, that kind of goes hand in hand with the pick your battles, right? When I think about that, I think about the saying, knowing when or learning how to agree to disagree, right? So knowing when it's a circumstance or a situation where, we're not going to find a common ground. It doesn't appear that, we're going to reach a place of understanding, at least maybe not right now. And so for that matter, I may need to just let it go for the time being. All right. 10 quick tips to resolving conflict. Let's see, what are they? Choose a good time and place, right? So be mindful of the environment. Commit to finding a solution that satisfies each person, right? So we're looking for collaboration. Goes back to that component. Listen carefully, right? And restate what we've heard. Kind of lends itself to that communication piece that we talked about, making sure that we are fully understanding. All right. Remain calm and avoid becoming defensive, which can be easy to do, right? Especially if we feel like if we feel like the finger's being pointed to us, or we feel like we are being identified as doing something wrong. We got to resist that urge to become defensive. Talk about the issues and not people, right? Again, that can be a challenge, right? Because when I think about a conflict, I very well may be thinking about a person, right? Because I'm having a conflict with the person. And so it can be easy for me to just look at you as the source of my conflict as opposed to the issue at hand, right? Because the reality of the situation is, if it were someone else, I could still very well be having a conflict. Now, my relationship with the person may, at times cause me to not view it as a conflict, or maybe perhaps instead allow me to tolerate a little bit more, but it's still a conflict nonetheless. I just have greater tolerance with one person than the other. So it's a little bit easier for me if I focus on the issue, and it's a little bit more effective for me to focus on the issue when it comes to trying to resolve the conflict rather than the person. Use I statements, right? I statements are definitely better than you statements, right? Because you statements are really quick to get the other person's defenses up, right? If I am harping over what you did and you did this, you did that, I can expect you to become very defensive. I could expect you to not want to hear anything else that I really have to say. And so while I am needing to address or acknowledge what you've done, what's more important is for me to talk about how I feel and why I might feel that way based on what you've done. Okay. We want to acknowledge points of agreement, right? It's good to find those points of agreement as quickly as we can, and Because the opposite is what happens sometimes is rather than finding those points of agreement, uh, we're more quick and apt to find points of disagreement, right? And instead, we spend too much time on those points of disagreement, making it difficult for us to resolve the conflict. But the quicker we can identify areas or points that we agree on, the easier it becomes to us for us to work towards collaboration. We want to describe our emotions. We want to be specific in describing what we need, right? And we want to be open to creative solutions, right? I don't want to box myself in and think that the resolution to the conflict has to be a certain way, and that's the only way that it's going to resolve the conflict. Preparing for the conversation, right? So one, we want to determine the nature of the conflict. So considering the task or focus of the conflict, any processes that are associated with the conflict, and relationships, right? And so from a task standpoint, is this a one-time occurrence, this conflict or issue that is coming up? Process, is it a repeated occurrence, right? What are the patterns of events associated with the conflict? And then relationship, how is this conflict potentially going to impact the relationship that I have with this person? Or and so in that instance, I want to make the relationship the focus. That's pretty instrumental, especially for marriages and romantic relationships, things like that. It may be very important to focus on the relationship aspect of things. We want to be sure to not over personalize the issue. We want to understand our position and gather background info or data that may be necessary when discussing the issue. And we want to determine what the desired outcome should or will be, what we're willing to sacrifice, and then the motivation and goals of ourselves and others connected to the conflict. All right, so we have this quote: whenever you're in conflict with someone, there is one factor that can make the difference between damaging your relationship and deepening it, and that factor is attitude. Man, what's our attitude when we're going into conflict? That's powerful. All right, am I going at it with the right attitude or the wrong attitude? Am I going in it with a combative attitude or a collaborative or compromising attitude? Am I going in it with an attitude that is seeking peace, or am I harboring resentment and bitterness? All right. Attitude impacts a lot of how we communicate, and it influences how we manage our emotions, right? And also kind of looking at those two things, managing our emotions and how we relieve stress. My attitude can have a great influence one way or the other on that. In short, though, conflict, when handled correctly, strengthens us. Conflict, when handled correctly, strengthens us. And hopefully we can see that. Hopefully when we reflect back on conflicts that we've had, we're able to see just how they have strengthened us, how they've built character, how they've helped us to develop skills that we didn't have prior to the conflict, how they've helped us to better manage our emotions or even identify our emotions. Those are all things for us to look at and consider when it comes to ways in which conflict, when handled properly, can strengthen us, right? And then likewise, also kind of looking at those conflicts that we've had in the past and looking at the times when we didn't handle conflict effectively. reflecting back on the relationships that may have been lost because we didn't handle those conflicts effectively, or opportunities that may have been missed out on. And then too, ways that we may have delayed growth opportunities in ourselves.